12 northern states, over 20 years of Sharia law, and right now there is a quiet conversation happening in Abuja, not on the floor of the National Assembly, not in any press conference, that could decide whether Bola Tinubu wins a second term or loses the presidency entirely. Not because of fuel prices, not because of the naira, because of a constitutional argument that almost nobody in the South is paying attention to. While everyone is debating whether Tinubu will survive the economy, nobody is asking the more dangerous question: who is engineering the Sharia conversation and why now? I'll tell you something before we go any further. By the end of this video, I will show you that the people who are loudest about ending Sharia may not actually want it ended, and that, right there, is the trap. Before we go further, if you are new here, Naija Update 24/7 exists for one reason: to give every Nigerian, wherever you are, whatever region you are from, the political analysis that mainstream media won't touch. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. Let us start with what is actually happening, because the way this story is being told in most Nigerian media is incomplete, and that incompleteness is itself part of the politics. Over the past several months, there has been a renewed wave of calls to review or phase out the enforcement of Sharia criminal law in the 12 northern states that adopted it between 1999 and 2002. These calls are coming from civil society organizations, from some southern legislators making public statements, and from a quieter but significant group of northern progressives who have privately opposed the politicization of Sharia for years, but have rarely been given a platform to say so openly. The conversation intensified noticeably following a series of judicial rulings in Kano, Zamfara, and Sokoto that attracted national and international media attention in late 2024 and into 2025. Those rulings reminded Nigerians that Sharia criminal enforcement is not a historical relic. It is an active legal system operating in parallel with the federal court structure right now, today. But here is what you must understand. This is not one movement with one agenda. There are at least three distinct groups driving this conversation, and they want three very different things. The first group is made up of genuine human rights and constitutional law advocates. Their argument is straightforward. The 1999 Constitution does not permit a state government to adopt a state religion, and the criminal enforcement of Sharia crosses that line. They have been making this argument for 20 years. What is different now is that their argument is getting political amplification it never had before, and that amplification is coming from people with very different motives. The second group is made up of southern political voices who see the Sharia question as electoral leverage ahead of 2027. They are not necessarily interested in constitutional reform. They are interested in forcing Tinubu to choose a side. And the third group, the one most people are not talking about, is made up of certain northern governors and power brokers who are doing their own calculations about what Nigeria looks like after Tinubu. Now, to understand why any of this matters, you need a brief piece of history. When Sharia criminal law was adopted across the north between 1999 and 2002, it was not simply a religious movement, it was a political one. It emerged as a direct response to the return of southern-dominated federal power under Olusegun Obasanjo. The adoption of Sharia was a declaration of northern political identity, a way of saying we are not merely subjects of this federal structure, we have our own authority and our own law. It was always political. Understanding that is the foundation of everything else I am about to tell you. And one more thing before we move forward. Here is what most people miss entirely. The 1999 Constitution that everyone cites as prohibiting Sharia state was itself drafted by a military transition council. The ambiguity in that document was not an oversight, it was intentional. Nobody resolved it then, and that unresolved ambiguity has now become a political weapon. So, which institutions actually have the power to do something about this, and what are their limits? The conversation touches at least 5 major institutional actors: the National Assembly, specifically its Constitution Review Committee, the Supreme Court of Nigeria, which, and this is important, has never delivered a definitive ruling on the constitutionality of Sharia criminal enforcement at the state level, the State Houses of Assembly in the 12 affected states, the Council of State and the National Council of Traditional Rulers, and perhaps most significantly, the office of the Sultan of Sokoto, which is arguably the most politically consequential non-elected institution in Nigeria. Let us talk about the constitutional framework, because this is where things get complicated in ways that have real political consequences. Section 10 of the 1999 Constitution states that neither the federal government nor any state government shall adopt any religion as a state religion. That seems clear. But Section 38 of the same Constitution guarantees freedom of religion for every Nigerian, and the fourth schedule gives state government wide legislative competence in areas not exclusively reserved for the federal government. These three provisions sit in tension with each other, and the Supreme Court has never been asked to resolve that tension directly in the context of Sharia criminal enforcement. That absence, that legal vacuum, is not accidental. It has been preserved because resolving it would be politically catastrophic for whoever forces the question. Now, here's what this means practically. For the federal government to move against Sharia would require one of two things: either a constitutional amendment, which requires a 2/3 majority in the National Assembly plus the approval of at least 24 state houses of assembly, or a referral to the Supreme Court for a definitive ruling. Both paths are politically explosive. An amendment cannot pass without northern state assemblies voting against their own Sharia laws. That's not going to happen under current political pressure. And the Supreme Court referral, while legally clean, would generate the kind of national tension that could destabilize an already fragile security environment. And the most important institutional point of all, the President of Nigeria has no direct legal mechanism to abolish, suspend, or modify state Sharia law. None. This is a federal system. State law is state law. Whatever the president says about Sharia is political signaling. It is not governance. It cannot be governance. Which means Tinubu has been dragged onto a stage where he has no instrument to perform, only an audience waiting to judge him. So, if the president cannot legally touch Sharia, then why is this becoming his problem? Stay with me because the answer involves someone you have not heard mentioned yet in this conversation. This is the section that changes everything. Everything I have told you so far, the constitutional ambiguity, the institutional paralysis, the multiple actors with different agendas, all of it comes together here. Who benefits from raising this issue right now, 18 months before a presidential election? Start with the opposition. Figures aligned with the Labour Party and the PDP have been watching the APC's northern base carefully for the first signs of structural fracture. And what the Sharia debate does, brilliantly from an opposition strategy perspective, is create a political vice around Tinubu. If he supports a review of Sharia, he risks alienating the northern conservative base that APC depends on for votes and for gubernatorial loyalty. If he publicly opposes any review, he loses credibility with progressive southern voters, middle belt communities, and internationally minded Nigerians who care about constitutional governance. There is no position he can take that does not cost him something significant. That is not an accident. That is engineering. But the opposition is only part of the story. The more sophisticated layer of this strategy involves certain APC northern governors themselves. Not every APC governor in the north is fully committed to a Tinubu 2027 ticket. Some of them are already running quiet calculations about what the APC looks like after Tinubu. Who leads it, who benefits from its structure, and what role they play in that transition. For these governors, keeping the Sharia question alive as a political fire is strategically valuable. As long as it burns, they remain indispensable. They become the people Abuja must negotiate with to keep the North calm. They can deliver northern support or withhold it, based entirely on what they receive from the presidency in return. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Here is the counterintuitive truth that almost nobody in Nigerian political commentary is willing to say directly. The governors who are loudest about defending Sharia may not be its most sincere defenders. They may be its most sophisticated managers. There's a difference between a man who defends something because he believes in it and a man who defends something because its continued existence is the source of his political leverage. In Nigerian politics, you need to learn to tell those two men apart. And now, Now you understand what I told you at the very beginning of this video. The people loudest about keeping Sharia are not necessarily its most sincere defenders, they are its most skilled managers. The trap for Tinubu is this: he must either fight these governors or continue to feed them, and both options carry a cost that compounds as 2027 gets closer. Who else risks losing in this dynamic? The Sultan of Sokoto's office has historically served as the primary institutional channel between northern Islamic governance and federal power. Any federal overreach on this question bypasses that architecture entirely, which is itself a provocation, regardless of the substance. Middle belt political leaders who have built careers as bridge builders between the Sharia states and the South face marginalization if this issue becomes binary and tribal. And the APC's national structure, which was assembled on a carefully engineered northern-southern power-sharing arrangement, faces a kind of stress it was not designed to survive cleanly. The electoral mathematics are stark. Tinubu won in 2023 with a fractured opposition and structural party advantage. In 2027, that opposition is more organized, more motivated, and more funded. His margin for error is close to zero. Losing even 15 to 20% of his northern APC base votes through either a pro-Sharia or anti-Sharia misstep is not a setback, it is a terminal result. I want to speak directly now to every Nigerian watching this, not to the political actors, not to the analysts, but to the person in Lagos managing rising food prices, the trader in Kano navigating insecurity, the civil servant in Abuja watching their purchasing power shrink. Because this debate has consequences for your life that go well beyond who wins in 2027. The first consequence is structural. If the federal government is seen as pressuring northern states on their internal religious law, even indirectly, even through silence that is interpreted as endorsement of the pressure, it sets a precedent for federal overreach into state legislative authority. And that precedent will not stop at religion. Today it is Sharia in the north, tomorrow it can be resource control legislation in the south-south, land use laws in the southwest, customary court systems in the southeast. When the principle of state legislative autonomy is eroded, it is eroded for everyone. No region is protected by celebrating its erosion in a region they disagree with. The second consequence is economic, and it is immediate. The north of Nigeria produces the bulk of the country's staple food supply. Political instability in the north, the kind that follows from a mismanaged religious political crisis, directly impacts food supply chains to every other region. For Nigerians already navigating food inflation above 30%, northern instability is not an abstract political problem. It lands on your table. The third consequence is security, and this one requires careful language. Boko Haram and ISWAP have historically exploited any narrative of federal hostility towards northern Islamic identity as a recruitment and mobilization tool. A mismanaged Sharia debate does not need to be anti-Islamic in intent to be weaponized as anti-Islamic in narrative. The insurgency does not wait for accuracy, it moves on perception, and the most dangerous outcome of this entire debate may have nothing to do with Sharia at all. It is that while the political class fight over this constitutional theater, the insurgency in the northeast and the banditry across the northwest continue to expand, fed by diverted attention, diverted resources, and the permanent absence of the political will needed to address them seriously.
The final layer of this story is the one Nigerian political discourse tends to underestimate: the international dimension. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union have all issued periodic reports and advisories citing Sharia criminal law enforcement in Nigeria as a human rights concern, particularly as it relates to women's rights, the rights of religious minorities, and due process protections. They have been careful not to make this a loud public pressure campaign because Nigeria is too strategically important as Africa's largest economy and as a counterterrorism partner for direct confrontation. But the concern is documented, it is institutional, and it shapes how Nigeria is evaluated in multilateral forums. For Nigerians in the diaspora, in the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, and across Europe, this matters for reasons that are directly practical. This debate affects Nigeria's standing under AGOA trade preferences. It affects EU trade relationships. It affects the perception of Nigeria's democratic governance trajectory among the institutional investors that any Nigerian government needs to fund its budget. And it affects diaspora remittance confidence. When political stability is visibly in question, diaspora Nigerians slow capital flows home. That is not a political opinion. It is a documented behavioral pattern. The 2027 election will be watched internationally. A Tinubu government that is seen as fractured or paralyzed over a religious political crisis arrives at that election diminished in ways that cannot be recovered through economic announcements alone. I want to address the strongest arguments on the other side, because serious analysis requires taking the opposing view seriously, not dismissing it. The first argument is that Sharia in the North represents the democratic will of the people and must be respected. This argument has real weight. Northern populations, through their elected representatives, did adopt Sharia law. Democratic legitimacy is not nothing, it matters. But democratic legitimacy does not override constitutional supremacy. And the people of the North are not a single voice. There are significant minorities within Sharia states, non-Muslim communities, women whose access to justice is structurally constrained, Northern lawyers and academics who have argued for decades that criminal enforcement of Sharia creates a two-tiered justice system, who did not choose this and live under it regardless. A constitution that cannot enforce its own supremacy uniformly is not a functional constitution for any Nigerian, North or South. The second argument is that this debate is a Southern agenda designed to delegitimize the North. Emotionally, that narrative lands for many people, but it collapses under scrutiny. The most sophisticated and sustained critics of Sharia's political administration have historically come from within the North itself. Northern constitutional lawyers, Northern academics, Northern civil society figures, and quietly, some traditional rulers who understand the difference between religious practice and political exploitation of religious identity. Reducing a constitutional question to regional aggression is precisely what political actors who benefit from the current confusion want you to do, because as long as you're arguing about regions, you are not asking who specifically benefits from keeping this unresolved. The third argument is that Tinubu should simply stay out of it and let it pass. Politically, that is tempting advice, but it is structurally impossible. As president, his silence is a position. In a hyper-politicized environment approaching an election cycle, non-action is action, and it will be read and characterized by every political actor in the field. What Tinubu actually needs is not silence. It is a structured institutional process, a referral to the Supreme Court, a formal constitutional review commission, something that removes him personally from the political firing line by converting a campaign weapon into a legal procedure. The question is never what is good for the North or what is good for the South. The question is whether Nigeria has a constitutional framework that applies equally, protects everyone, and can actually be enforced. That is the only question that matters for a country of 220 million people trying to build something that lasts. So, what happens next? What should you actually watch for? From Tinubu's camp, expect quiet back-channel engagement with northern governors and with the Sultan's office, the kind of engagement that never appears in any press release. Watch for presidential statements that affirm respect for diversity and Nigeria's multi-religious heritage without ever naming Sharia directly. That deliberate ambiguity is the containment strategy. It is an attempt to signal different things to different audiences simultaneously. And the risk is that sophisticated political actors on all sides will see through it. From the opposition, expect Labour Party and PDP-aligned voices to keep this issue alive in the media and in civil society, not because they want to resolve it legislatively, but because an unresolved issue generates continuous pressure. The goal is not a Sharia bill. The goal is to force a visible Tinubu response that can be criticized from at least two directions simultaneously. Among northern governors, watch for differentiation. Governors in states with the strongest religious institutional infrastructure, Sokoto, Zamfara, Kano, will be the loudest in public defense of Sharia. Governors in more mixed or transitional states, Kaduna, Plateau, Niger, may signal quieter, more nuanced positions. That differentiation is the early sign of the internal ACP fracture that the opposition is trying to accelerate. Now, I told you earlier to watch for someone who had not yet been named. Here is who it is: the National Judicial Council and the Office of the Attorney General of the Federation. The only pathway that takes this out of campaign territory into governance territory without a political explosion runs through those two institutions. A quiet, properly framed referral to the Supreme Court would do two things simultaneously. It would give Tinubu political cover by converting the question from a presidential stance into a judicial process. And it would begin building, however slowly, the legal clarity that Nigeria has avoided for 25 years. Whether this administration has the institutional discipline to make that move is the signal to watch for. If you see the Attorney General's office begin to make careful public statements, framing this as a constitutional matter requiring judicial resolution, that is Abuja beginning to find its way out of the trap.
I asked you at the start of this video, who is engineering the Sharia question and why now? You have the answer. It is not primarily a religious debate. It is a 2027 electoral instrument, carefully positioned to force a sitting president into an unwinnable stance at the most politically sensitive window of his first term. The institutions that could resolve it legally cannot move without political cost. The political actors who could defuse it are the same ones who benefit from keeping it live. And the president at the center of it has no legal mechanism to act, only the political consequences of how he responds. Ending Sharia is not, in constitutional terms, within Tinubu's power, but the political consequences of how he handles this conversation are entirely his to manage or mismanage. The trap is real. Whether he walks into it will tell us more about the intelligence of this administration than any budget presentation or economic reform announcement. And for every Nigerian watching this, north, south, east, west, the question to hold on to is this: when your leaders are consumed by political theater, who is minding the country? When the argument is about symbols, who is solving the problems? That question never gets old in Nigeria, and it will never stop being the right question to ask. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one Nigerian who needs to understand what is really happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Naija Update 24/7. We never stop watching.